To one of the most disturbing accounts ever documented in the antebellum South, welcome. A testimony so profoundly haunting that even the federal agents who recorded it, back in 1866, described it as being beyond the capacity of civilized comprehension. An exaggeration, this is not. A legend, this is not. This is the verified, sworn testimony of a man named Solomon Northrop James, a man who spent 3 decades enslaved on a Louisiana plantation, a place where the boundaries between cruelty and madness dissolved entirely. A place where human suffering became a form of currency, and where the very house seemed to pulse with the accumulated anguish of those who had died within its walls. Before we descend into this darkness together, I want you to do something for me. Comment below and tell us where you're watching from and what the time is in your part of the world. This story transcends both geography and time, connecting all of us who choose to bear witness to what was endured, to what was survived, and to what must never, ever be forgotten. Now, let us travel back. Back to a place where Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds from ancient oaks, where the air itself tasted of decay and delta water, where an entire economic system was built upon the systematic destruction of the human soul. The year is 1834. The place is St. Bernard Parish, Louisiana, a landscape of endless wetlands, sluggish bayous, and plantations carved from swampland. This carving was done through the labor of enslaved people, the ones who drained the marshes, built the levees, and transformed wilderness into profitable agriculture. This was the heart of the Deep South Sugar Empire, a place where fortunes were made not in gold, but in cane, molasses, and the bodies of men, women, and children, bodies worked literally to death during the grinding season. In every sense, the climate was oppressive. The summer brought heat so thick it felt solid, and humidity that made breathing an act of will. In biblical proportions, mosquitoes swarmed, carrying yellow fever, malaria, and dengue. Little respite was offered by winter, just cold rain, fog that turned the world grey and indistinct, and a dampness that penetrated to the bone. Hostile to human life, the land itself seemed, which perhaps made it easier for those in power to treat human beings as disposable resources, as temporary tools to be used until they broke and were then replaced. Approximately 60% of the population of St. Bernard Parish in 1834 was enslaved. In small numbers, free people of color existed, occupying a precarious social position. Some owned property. Some, navigating the impossible contradiction of their existence, even owned slaves themselves. Everything was controlled by white planters. The land, the law, the local militia, the courts, the churches, all of it. The entire apparatus of society was designed to maintain a racial hierarchy so rigid, so absolute, that questioning it was not merely illegal, but philosophically impossible within the dominant worldview. In this landscape of systematic dehumanization, there stood a plantation known officially as Bellerive, beautiful riverbank in French, though there was nothing beautiful about it. Nearly 800 acres of sugarcane fields, processing facilities, outbuildings, and a main house were encompassed by the estate. The main house rose 3 stories from the muddy ground, painted white, but perpetually stained with mildew and the reddish dust that blew in from the fields. Built in the French colonial style, the house had wide galleries on every level, tall windows to catch whatever breeze might offer relief, and a cellar that extended deep into the earth, unusual for the region, where high water tables typically made below-ground construction impossible. The plantation was owned by Etienne Larveau, a man of French Creole extraction whose family had been in Louisiana since the early 1700s. In 1834, Etienne was 42 years old, a widower whose wife had died giving birth to a stillborn child 3 years earlier. He never remarried. Alone in that vast house he lived, except for the enslaved people who served him and the occasional visits from his business partners and fellow planters. Throughout the parish, Etienne was known as an educated man. He had studied in Paris, spoke 4 languages, and collected books on philosophy, natural science, and medicine. He was also known as a harsh master, though not unusually so by the standards of the time. The way farmers discussed fertilizer, planters compared notes on discipline methods. An aberration, cruelty was not. It was policy. In 1834, Etienne Larveau owned 137 enslaved people, though that number fluctuated constantly due to deaths, purchases, and sales. Meticulous records of his human property were kept by him, names, ages, estimated values, skills, health conditions, disciplinary issues. These ledgers still exist, preserved in the Louisiana State Archives, and they read like inventories of livestock, which is precisely what they were intended to be. Among those 137 people was a man named Solomon. He was 26 years old when he arrived at Bellerive in August of 1834, sold at auction in New Orleans after his previous owner died of cholera. Born free in New York, Solomon was the son of an emancipated slave who had built a small carpentry business. A violinist, a skilled craftsman, a husband, and a father of 3 children, Solomon himself had been all these things. And then in the summer of 1834, he had been kidnapped, drugged, transported south in chains, and sold into bondage under a false name. His freedom papers had been destroyed. His identity had been erased. His former life might as well have never existed. For 30 years, he would not see freedom again. And what he would witness during those 3 decades would haunt him until his death in 1884, 50 years after he first walked through the gates of Bellerive and understood that he had entered a place where the normal rules of human behavior did not apply. By Solomon's own account, the first weeks at Bellerive were merely horrific. He was put to work in the cane fields, which during harvest season meant 18 to 20-hour days of back-breaking labor under the supervision of an overseer named Claude Boudreau, a white man from the Acadian settlements who carried a bullwhip and used it liberally. Designed to break people, the work was. The heat was incapacitating. Like razors, the cane leaves cut. Day and night during grinding season, the mill ran, and enslaved people worked in rotating shifts, some tending the fields, others feeding cane into the crushing rollers, others boiling the juice in massive cauldrons where one misstep meant being scalded alive. Regularly, people died. The highest of any form of North American slavery was the mortality rate on sugar plantations. Death from exhaustion, from heat stroke, from infected wounds, from diseases that ravaged bodies already weakened by malnutrition and overwork. Death from accidents with the machinery, death from punishment. Behind the sugar house, the dead were buried in an unmarked plot, graves dug in haste and filled in quickly because there was always more work to be done. But there were other deaths, disappearances that did not quite make sense. In his 3rd month at Bellerive, Solomon first noticed this. A young woman named Marie, who worked in the main house as a domestic servant, simply vanished one October morning. Cautiously in fragments of conversation that ended abruptly when anyone approached, the other enslaved people whispered about it. Some said she had tried to run and been caught by slave catchers and sold away south, though no one had actually seen this happen. Overcome by despair, others said she had drowned herself in the bayou. But an older man named Baptiste, who had been at Bellerive for over 20 years, said something else late one night when he thought no one was listening. She went to the cellar. Solomon asked what that meant. Baptiste looked at him with eyes that held no hope at all and said simply, "You'll find out. Everyone finds out eventually." That winter, there were sounds at night. In one of the slave cabins, Solomon slept rough wooden structures with dirt floors, no windows, cracks in the walls wide enough to see through. Into a space designed for perhaps 20, 40 people were crowded. At the best of times, sleep was difficult, but on certain nights, usually when the moon was dark and the fog lay thick over the fields, there were sounds that had no natural explanation. A low rhythmic scraping, like heavy objects being dragged across stone, muffled cries that seemed to come from the earth itself, and once, a scream, sudden, piercing, abruptly cut off, that came from the direction of the main house. In the morning, no one spoke of it, but Solomon saw fear in faces that had learned to show nothing. There were other oddities. In January of 1835, a crew of white laborists arrived from New Orleans, not local men, but strangers, Germans, or possibly Poles, who spoke little English and kept to themselves. For 3 weeks, they worked exclusively on the main house, and during this time, enslaved people were forbidden from approaching. Meals for the house staff were prepared in an outdoor kitchen and carried in by Boudreau himself, which was unusual since overseers did not typically perform such tasks. Day and night, the sound of hammering and sawing continued. When the work was finished, the laborists were paid and left immediately, taking a riverboat north. One of them left behind a flask, found later by a field hand. Of whiskey, it still smelled, But there was something else in it, a bitter, medicinal odor that none of the enslaved people could identify. After the renovations, there was a new door in the cellar. Once briefly, Solomon glimpsed it when he was sent to the main house to help move furniture. Steeply from a passage off the kitchen, the cellar stairs descended. At the bottom was a stone-walled room used for storing wine, preserved foods, and other goods that needed to be kept cool. But now, set into the far wall, there was a second door, made of thick timber reinforced with iron bands. It had 3 locks. On a ring attached to his belt, Etienne Larveau kept the keys. When Solomon asked another house servant about the door, the woman, her name was Let, went pale. "Don't ask about that," she whispered urgently. "Don't even think about it. That door is for the ones who are chosen." Chosen for what? Let turned away without answering. Context, though they raise more questions than they answer, is provided by the ledgers. Etienne Larvau's business records for the period between 1834 and 1847 are preserved in remarkable detail. Most antebellum plantation records were lost or destroyed during the Civil War. But Bellerive's documents survived because they were seized by Union forces in 1862 and sent north as evidence of the economic structure of slavery. Historians have analyzed these ledgers extensively, and within them are entries that defy easy explanation. Beginning in 1835, there are recurring payments to a doctor, Emile Toussaint, for medical consultation and supplies. The amounts are substantial, sometimes $50 or even $100 at a time, which represents a significant sum in 1830s currency. Plantation owners did occasionally employ physicians, but usually for emergencies or epidemics, and the payments were sporadic. Like a retainer, these payments to Dr. Toussaint were monthly. There are also purchases from apothecaries in New Orleans: chloroform, ether, laudanum, morphine, arsenic compounds, various acids and caustic substances, surgical instruments, and materials for suturing and bandaging. Far beyond what would be needed for routine medical care of enslaved workers are the quantities. In one 6-month period in 1837, Larveau purchased enough chloroform to anesthetize a person daily for a year. Most disturbing are the entries in a separate ledger, smaller and more private, that was discovered hidden behind a false panel in Larvau's desk when the house was inventoried in 1862. This ledger contains names, but they are not the names of the enslaved people listed in the main records. They are different names, sometimes just initials: Subject T, Subject R, Subject M. Next to each name are dates and brief notes: initial procedure, successful, secondary application, adverse reaction, terminated. A typical entry from April 1839 reads: Subject H, male, age approximately 22. First intervention April 12. Consciousness maintained throughout. Tissue response noted. Duration 4 hours. Expired April 14. Cause: systemic shock. Notes recorded in Medical Journal Volume 3. The medical journals referenced in these entries have never been found. Also in the hidden ledger are financial records that do not appear in the official plantation books. Payments received from individuals identified only by initials, received from JB $200 for demonstration, received from LC $150 for observation privileges. These entries suggest that whatever was happening at Bellerive, it was not happening in isolation. Others knew. Others participated. Others paid for the privilege. In the New Orleans Daily Picayune from December 1838, there is a small notice: reward $20 for information leading to the whereabouts of a Negro man named Isaac, property of Mrs. Elizabeth Duchamp. Disappeared from her household in November. Last seen in the company of a man claiming to be a slave trader. Any information may be directed to the address below. In Larvau's hidden ledger, dated November 1838, Subject I, acquired via third party. Payment rendered. Commenced November 18th. The dates align. The initial matches. Into whatever darkness existed beyond that iron-banded door, Isaac disappeared, and the official record shows no trace of what happened to him afterward. Like a photograph emerging in chemical solution, Solomon's understanding of what was truly happening at Bellerive developed slowly. Initially, he was not part of the house staff, so he had limited access to the main building. From whispered conversations, from the fear he saw in others, from the pattern of disappearances, and from the sounds that continued night after night when the air was still and the darkness complete, his knowledge came. In the summer of 1837, Solomon was reassigned. His carpentry skills had been noted, and he was brought into a work crew repairing buildings on the plantation. This gave him more mobility, more opportunity to observe. He noticed that certain enslaved people, when they displeased the master or the overseer, were not whipped in the fields like others. They were taken to the main house. Sometimes they returned, hollow-eyed and silent. Sometimes they did not return at all. He noticed that Dr. Toussaint visited every 2 weeks, arriving in the evening and staying until dawn. The doctor was a small, neat man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers who carried a leather medical bag and spoke French in a low, cultured voice. He never acknowledged the enslaved people, never looked at them directly, as if they were furniture. He noticed that Etienne Larveau himself was changing. The master had always been cold, remote, but in those years he became something else. A feverish intensity took on his eyes. He spent hours alone in his study, writing furiously in journals that he kept locked in a safe. He stopped attending church, stopped receiving social visits. According to letters preserved in various family collections, other planters commented on it. One acquaintance wrote in 1839, "Etienne has become peculiar in his habits and withdrawn from society. I fear his mind has been affected by solitude and the burden of managing such a large enterprise alone." But it was not solitude that had changed Etienne Larveau. It was what he was doing in the cellar beneath his house. In the spring of 1840, Solomon learned the truth. And he learned it because he was chosen. He had been working on repairing the gallery of the main house when he made a mistake, a minor error in measurement that resulted in a board being cut too short. Boudreau saw it and reported it to Larveau. That evening, Solomon was summoned to the main house. He expected a whipping, perhaps time in the stocks, the usual punishments. Instead, he was taken down to the cellar. The main cellar room was cold, lit by oil lamps that cast shifting shadows on the stone walls. Wooden racks lined with wine bottles. Barrels of salted meat stood in corners. And at the far end was the door, the iron-banded door with 3 locks. Before that door, Etienne Larveau stood, the keys in his hand. Dr. Toussaint was there as well, his medical bag on a nearby table. Neither man spoke to Solomon. They spoke to each other in French, discussing something in technical terms he did not fully understand, words like specimen, tolerance threshold, preliminary assessment. The door was unlocked. All 3 locks, one after another, each one making a heavy metallic sound that echoed in the stone chamber. The door swung open, and beyond it was darkness and a smell, chemical and organic, antiseptic and rotten, a smell that made Solomon's stomach heave. "Inside," Larveau said in English. Solomon hesitated. Boudreau, behind him, shoved him forward. Beyond the door was a corridor, stone-walled, descending deeper into the earth. The air was colder, damper. The walls glistened with moisture. Along this corridor, there were doors, cell doors with barred windows. As Solomon was pushed forward, he glimpsed faces behind those bars, people he recognized, people who had disappeared from the plantation weeks or months before. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes empty of everything except suffering. At the end of the corridor was a larger room. This was where the work was done. It was set up like a medical theater. In the center was a table, wooden with leather restraints attached at multiple points. The walls were lined with shelves, holding bottles, instruments, specimens preserved in jars of cloudy liquid. To one side stood a desk, covered with journals and loose papers filled with notes and diagrams. From the ceiling, oil lamps hung, providing cold, bright light. To the table, Solomon was strapped. He struggled, but Boudreau and another man, a house servant forced into complicity, held him down while the restraints were tightened. He could not move. He could barely breathe. Over him stood Larveau and Dr. Toussaint. The doctor opened his medical bag and began removing instruments, scalpels, clamps, needles, bottles of clear liquid. "This is a preliminary examination," Dr. Toussaint said in accented English, as if lecturing students. "We will assess baseline responses, pain tolerance, cardiovascular reaction, psychological resilience." The subject will remain conscious throughout. Anesthesia would compromise the data. Solomon tried to speak, to plead, to ask what they were going to do to him. No words came out. Terror had paralyzed his voice. What happened next, Solomon would describe in his 1866 testimony as beyond the power of language to convey. He said that he experienced pain of such intensity that his mind separated from his body, watching from some distant place as Dr. Chuzant worked with calm precision, making incisions, applying various substances to the wounds, recording Solomon's reactions in a journal, while Lavo held a lamp close and observed intently. He said the experience lasted hours, though he could not be certain because time lost all meaning. He said he screamed until his voice was gone, and then he screamed silently, and the screaming continued inside his head long after his body had been released. When it was over, he was unstrapped, dragged back down the corridor, and thrown into one of the cells. He lay on the stone floor, his body alight with agony, and understood that this was his life now. This was what Bellerive truly was. The fields, the labor, the ordinary cruelties, those were merely the surface. Beneath it all was this, a place where human beings were reduced to experimental material, where their pain was data, where their deaths were recorded in neat handwriting and filed away in leather-bound journals. He understood that he was not going to escape. He understood that no one was coming to save him. He understood that this would continue until he died, or until something broke so fundamentally inside him that death would be a mercy. But he did not die. Not that night. Not in the weeks that followed. For 3 months, Solomon spent in the cellar. He was taken to the examination room 11 times. Between sessions, he remained in the cell, given minimal food and water, left alone in the dark except when Dr. Chuzant came to observe his recovery and take notes. There were others in the cells around him. He never learned all their names because speech was difficult, and because people died and were replaced by new prisoners, and the cycle continued without pause. He learned that the experiments varied. Sometimes it was surgical incisions made without anesthesia, organs exposed, responses measured and recorded. Sometimes it was chemical substances injected or forced down the throat, effects monitored as the subject convulsed or hallucinated or burned from the inside. Sometimes it was psychological, prolonged isolation, sensory deprivation, exposure to disturbing stimuli designed to break the mind. Particularly interested in pain tolerance and the limits of human endurance was Dr. Chuzant. He believed that enslaved people, through generations of hardship, had developed physiological differences that made them more resilient to suffering. He was testing this hypothesis methodically, scientifically, using methods that would later be recognized as torture, but were described in his notes as controlled experimentation. Both patron and participant was Lavo's role. He funded the research, provided the subjects, and assisted in the procedures. But he was also conducting his own investigation into what he called the degradation threshold, the point at which a human being ceased to be recognizably human, when identity dissolved and only the animal remained. His journals, portions of which were later found and preserved, contain lengthy philosophical musings on the nature of suffering, the relationship between soul and body, and whether consciousness itself could be measured and manipulated. In one passage from his journal, dated July 1840, Lavo wrote, "Subject S, the carpenter, has proven remarkably resilient. Dr. T had predicted collapse after the 4th session, but the subject maintains coherence. His resistance is fascinating, not physical, as his body has been thoroughly compromised, but mental. He retreats into himself, into some interior fortress we have not yet breached. This presents an interesting challenge. How deep can we penetrate before the fortress crumbles? What will remain when we finally break through?" Solomon survived because he did precisely what Lavo described. He retreated. He built walls inside his mind, compartments where he stored his memories of freedom, of his wife, of his children, of his life before. He recited passages from the Bible that his mother had taught him. He played violin music in his head, full concerts performed in the darkness of his cell. He held on to his name, his identity, his humanity, even as they tried to strip it away. And then, inexplicably, he was released from the cellar. It happened in August of 1840. The cell door opened and Boudreau was there. "Get up," the overseer said. You're going back to the fields. Solomon could barely walk. His body was a map of scars, some healed, some still weeping. But he dragged himself out of that darkness, up the stairs, out of the main house, into the brutal sunlight of a Louisiana summer. He was put back to work. No explanation was given. It was as if the previous 3 months had been erased. But they had not been erased. The cellar continued its work. Other people were taken. The screaming continued at night, muffled by stone and earth, but never quite silenced. And Solomon understood that he had not been released out of mercy. He had been released because they were done with him for now. He was a long-term study. They would observe his recovery, see how the trauma manifested over time, and then, eventually, they would take him back down. For 20 years, he lived with that knowledge. Throughout the 1840s and into the 1850s, the hidden machinery of Bellerive operated with terrible consistency. The pattern was always the same. People disappeared. Dr. Toussaint came and went. The cellar consumed its victims. And the official records showed nothing, just the normal death rate of a sugar plantation, which was high enough that a few extra bodies attracted no attention. But there were witnesses beyond the enslaved people. There had to be. The entries in Lavo's hidden ledger, received from JB for demonstration, received from LC for observation privileges, indicate that other planters, other wealthy men, were aware of what was happening and paid to watch. This was not one madman working in isolation. This was a network. In fragmentary form, evidence of this network exists. A letter from 1843, preserved in a private collection and discovered by historians in the 1960s, was written by a planter named Jacques Beaumont to a colleague. In it, Beaumont writes, "I recently had occasion to visit Lavo's estate, where he and the physician demonstrated techniques of remarkable efficacy. I confess I was disturbed by certain aspects, but one cannot argue with results. The level of control achieved is extraordinary, and the subject's capacity for endurance far exceeds prior estimations. Should you wish to observe yourself, I can arrange an introduction." From the diary of a traveling merchant who stopped at Bellerive in 1845 comes another piece of evidence. He wrote, "Dined with M. Lavo, a singular gentleman much absorbed in philosophical matters. The house is grand but neglected. The Negroes seem more fearful than is typical, scurrying about like whipped dogs. After dinner, Lavo invited me to view his special accommodations in the cellar. I declined, as his manner suggested something unwholesome. Took my leave early and was glad to be gone from that place. The authorities knew nothing, or chose to know nothing. Beyond the planters' self-regulation, St. Bernard Parish had no meaningful law enforcement. The state of Louisiana had laws governing the treatment of enslaved people, statutes that theoretically prohibited cruel and unusual punishment. But these laws were rarely enforced and never against wealthy white men. The testimony of enslaved people was not admissible in court except in rare circumstances. Self-concealing, the system was designed to be. Back in the fields, but forever marked by what he had endured, Solomon watched and waited. He knew that speaking would mean death. He knew that rebellion would mean death. He knew that running would mean death. So he survived. He worked. He obeyed. And he remembered. He remembered every face he saw in those cells. He remembered every scream he heard. He remembered the layout of the cellar, the contents of the examination room, the names written in the ledgers he had glimpsed. He memorized it all with the desperate precision of someone creating a memorial for the dead, a testimony that might someday, somehow, be told. 3 more times over the years, he was taken back to the cellar. Once in 1843. Once in 1848. Once in 1854. Each time he survived. Each time he was released back to the fields. An anomaly, he became a specimen of unusual durability, which perhaps was why Lavo kept him alive. The others were not so fortunate. In his 1866 testimony, Solomon estimated that at least 80 people died in that cellar during his 30 years at Bellerive. Others who survived and gave testimonies after the war suggested the number might be higher, perhaps over 100. The exact count will never be known. In unmarked graves, the dead were buried, their deaths attributed to disease or accident, their names forgotten. But history was moving. The nation was fracturing. The system that had allowed places like Bellerive to exist was approaching its violent end. Slowly, then all at once, the Civil War came to Louisiana. In April of 1862, New Orleans fell to Union forces. Federal gunboats pushed up the Mississippi. Plantations were occupied or abandoned. Sensing the shift, the enslaved people began to resist more openly, working more slowly, disappearing into the swamps, making their way to Union lines. Longer than most, Bellerive held out. Now 69 years old and increasingly frail, Etienne Larveau refused to evacuate. He remained in the main house with a handful of loyalists, Boudreaux, now gray-haired and arthritic, and a few house servants too terrified to leave. The fields went unworked. The sugar house stood silent. Most of the enslaved people had fled. But his property, Larveau would not surrender. And the cellar remained operational. Even as the world was ending around him, Larveau continued his work. Dr. Toussaint was gone. He had fled north in 1861, taking much of the documentation with him. But alone, Larveau worked, driven by an obsession that had long since consumed any remnant of sanity. Solomon was still there. He was 54 years old, his body broken by 3 decades of labor and torture, but he was still alive. And on the night of the 17th of March, 1863, everything finally ended. With fire, it began. The official report filed by a Union officer who investigated the scene days later states that the fire started in the cellar and spread rapidly through the main house. By the time it was noticed, the lower floors were fully engulfed. 4 hours, the house burned, the flames visible for miles across the flat delta landscape. But the fire was not an accident. It was set deliberately by a group of enslaved people who had remained at Bellerive, who had endured for years, and who finally chose to destroy the place that had destroyed so many others. Part of this group was Solomon, though in his later testimony he was careful about what details he provided. The act of arson, even against a slave owner's property, was still technically illegal under Union military law. But the basic facts are these. On the night of March 17th, a group of 7 people descended to the cellar while Larveau slept. They broke open the cells. There were 3 prisoners at that time, all near death. They spread lamp oil throughout the underground chambers. They set the fire. And from the outside, they barred the doors, trapping Larveau and Boudreaux in the burning house. The last entry in Larveau's journal, written the day before he died, reads, "The world above has descended into chaos, but the work continues. I have achieved insights that will be lost to history, understanding that future generations will not appreciate." The subjects below represent the culmination of 30 years of systematic investigation. Their suffering has purchased knowledge that cannot be otherwise obtained. If this record survives, let it be known that I sacrificed nothing I had not already abandoned: moral convention, social acceptance, spiritual comfort, all in pursuit of truth. The screams that echo through these chambers are the price of enlightenment. He burned with his house. In the ruins of the cellar, his body was found, along with the skeletal remains of numerous others, the prisoners who had died over the years and been disposed of carelessly, left in sealed chambers or shallow graves beneath the floor. In clinical language, the Union officer's report catalogues these findings: discovered extensive human remains in substructure, evidence of confinement, restraint, and inhumane treatment. Estimated 15 to 20 individuals. Further investigation impeded by structural collapse and advance of Confederate forces in the region. A total loss was the house. Already untended, the cane fields reverted to swamp. Seized by the Union Army, the property was classified as abandoned rebel property and eventually sold at auction after the war. The buyer demolished what little remained and never rebuilt. Except in memory and in testimony, Bellerive ceased to exist. The war was survived by Solomon. He joined a contraband camp, worked for the Union Army as a laborer, and eventually made his way north. He spent time in Washington, D.C., trying desperately to find his family, the wife and children he had been stolen from 30 years earlier. He never found them. Records were incomplete or destroyed. Names had changed. People had scattered or died. As if it had belonged to someone else, his former life was as lost to him. But a different purpose he found. In 1866, when the Freedmen's Bureau began collecting testimonies from formerly enslaved people, documenting their experiences for legal and historical purposes, Solomon came forward. Over the course of 5 days, he told his story, speaking to a bureau agent named Thomas Harrington, who transcribed every word in careful longhand. In the National Archives in Washington, D.C., the testimony is archived, catalogued as Case HTU-4, Louisiana District, Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. To 93 pages, it runs. In the entire collection, it is one of the most detailed and disturbing accounts. Names were named by Solomon, Etienne Lavo, Dr. Emile Toussaint, Claude Boudreau, and several other planters whom he believed had participated in or observed the experiments. In precise detail, he described the layout of the cellar, including the hidden corridor, the cells, the examination room. He recounted specific procedures he had witnessed or endured, providing dates and descriptions. He listed the names of victims he could remember, at least 40 individuals, though he acknowledged there were many more whose names he never learned. The testimony was filed. Officials read it. Some were skeptical. The account seemed too extreme, too novelistic. Others believed it, but felt powerless to act. Most of the men Solomon named were dead or had fled. Dr. Toussaint had disappeared. Some records suggest he went to France, others that he died in New York under an assumed name. In the fire, the physical evidence had been destroyed. And of the Reconstruction era, the prevailing attitude was to move forward, to rebuild, not to pursue every atrocity from the war years. No criminal charges were ever filed. No prosecutions. No justice. Preserved, Solomon's testimony was, but it was not publicized. In an archive, it sat, unread by the general public, known only to a handful of scholars. In 1884, Solomon himself died in Ohio, where he had been living in a small community of formerly enslaved people. He was 76 years old. His death certificate lists the cause as general debility and complications from old injuries. In a freedman's cemetery outside Cincinnati, he was buried. The cemetery still exists, though many of the grave markers have eroded or been lost. No longer known is Solomon's exact burial location. There, the story might have ended, lost to time, except that places like Bellerive do not disappear completely. They leave traces. They leave scars in the landscape and in the historical record. In 1932, during the Great Depression, a WPA project employed workers to clear overgrown plantation sites in St. Bernard Parish for potential agricultural use. When workers reached the old Bellerive property, they found the ruins of the main house, barely visible beneath decades of vegetation growth. They also found something else, a depression in the ground where the cellar had been, and beneath that, the entrance to the underground chambers that had been partially collapsed by the fire. To the site, a local historian named Margaret DeVoe was called. She documented what was found: stone corridors, iron cell doors still on their hinges, shackles and chains bolted to walls, fragments of glass bottles and metal instruments, and human remains, skulls, long bones, ribs scattered throughout the passages. She also found pieces of charred paper, fragments of the journals that had somehow survived the fire in a sealed metal box. DeVoe's report, filed with the Louisiana Historical Society, includes transcriptions of several readable journal entries. One, dated February 1851, describes in clinical detail a procedure performed on subject W, female, age estimated 19, that resulted in the subject's death after prolonged exposure to escalating dosages. Another entry from 1855 discusses the failure of compassion as a limiting factor in scientific advancement and argues that the inferior races provide an opportunity for investigation that would be morally impossible with our own kind, thus serving a purpose in God's design that transcends their temporal suffering. In 1932, the discovery made local newspapers, but only briefly. The Great Depression dominated the news. Disturbing, the findings were, but also distant relics of an era that Americans preferred not to examine too closely. In a common grave, the remains were collected and buried. The site was filled in and eventually forgotten again. Not until the 1970s, during renewed scholarly interest in slavery and the antebellum South, did researchers rediscover Solomon's testimony in the National Archives. In 1976, Historian Dr. Eleanor Washington published an article connecting the testimony to the archaeological evidence from 1932 and to various documents in the Louisiana State Archives. Her work established definitively that Bellerive had existed, that the experiments had occurred, and that Solomon's account was accurate. In the 1980s and 1990s, further research uncovered additional evidence: letters mentioning Lavau's research, invoices from medical suppliers, a partial patient ledger found in the estate papers of a New Orleans physician that included references to consultation regarding LS experimental subjects, census records showing unusually high mortality rates at Bellerive compared to neighboring plantations, newspaper notices of missing enslaved people whose last known locations aligned with periods of increased activity at Bellerive. In 2004, a team of forensic archaeologists returned to the site with ground-penetrating radar. They located at least 37 separate graves in the area where the slave burial ground had been. Due to concerns about desecrating the dead, excavation was not permitted, but the survey confirmed that the number of burials far exceeded the plantation's official death records. In 2011, a historical marker was placed near the site, on the side of a parish road that now cuts through what was once Bellerive. The marker is small, easy to miss. It reads, "Site of Bellerive Plantation, 1790 to 1863. This location represents the suffering of enslaved people under the institution of slavery. Archaeological evidence suggests that extreme abuses occurred here, including illegal confinement and experimentation." The testimony of survivors, particularly Solomon Northrop James, 1808 to 1884, has preserved the memory of those who died here. May we remember and never repeat these cruelties. Frequently vandalized, the marker is. It has been replaced 3 times. Today, the site is empty land, mostly wetland, reverting to swamp. Since the 1860s, the Mississippi River has shifted slightly, and the water table has risen. During heavy rains, the depressions where the house and cellar once stood fill with muddy water. Trees grow there now, cypress and tupelo, their roots reaching deep into soil that holds the bones of the forgotten. Of the area as haunted, local residents, particularly older black families whose ancestors were enslaved in the parish, speak. They report sounds at night when the wind is still, scraping, weeping, voices calling out. Some claim to have seen lights moving through the ruins when no one is there. As folklore, these stories are dismissed by some, but they persist across generations. Whether ghosts exist or not, the area is haunted by history, by the documented reality of what happened there, by the testimony of those who survived and those who did not, by the systematic cruelty that was not aberrational but structural, built into the economic and legal foundation of an entire society. With these words, Solomon's testimony ends, "I have told you what I witnessed and what was done to me and to so many others. I do not tell you this for your pity. I tell you this so that it cannot be denied, so that history must acknowledge what was endured. The men who did these things believed they were justified, that we were less than human, and therefore our suffering did not matter. But I am here. I survived. I have a voice. And I will use it to testify that every scream, every death, every moment of agony in that cellar mattered. We mattered. Remember us. In how we receive this testimony, we have a choice. We can turn away, declare it too disturbing, file it back in the archives, and return to more comfortable histories. Or we can sit with the discomfort, acknowledge what was done, and understand that these were not abstract historical forces, but individual human beings who suffered and died, whose names and stories deserve to be remembered. Gone is the cellar at Bellerive, filled with earth and water. But through time, the darkness it represented still echoes. It echoes in every system that dehumanizes people. In every justification for cruelty. In every moment when suffering is dismissed because those who suffer are deemed less worthy of concern. To tell his truth, Solomon survived. The least we can do is listen. And in listening, remember that the past is not the past. It lives in us, in the landscape, in the silences between what is said and what is known. In 1863, the screams from that cellar stopped. But the obligation to bear witness, to remember, to testify, that continues, passed from generation to generation, until the truth is so deeply embedded in our collective memory that it can never again be buried beneath respectability and silence. This is the most disturbing account from a former slave. This is what Solomon witnessed in 30 years of captivity. This is what we must carry forward, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. The responsibility of the living to honor the dead by refusing to let their suffering be forgotten.